I would describe my art as quite broad, sort of mixed bag of approaches. I'm primarily a sculptor. I like to think of myself as a sculptor, but I use a range of materials. And I've also made a lot of work, a lot of print work. So at one point in my career, I was focused on printmaking, and particularly in experimental printmaking. But I'm always drawn back to 3D. Usually when I start a project, when I start making work, the springboard is often an idea around something that's annoyed me, or something that frustrates me, or something that I feel we need to talk about and find an approach for it. So if it's something quite simple subject like exploitation, it's not a simple subject, but it's an understood subject, I find a different way to talk about it. So the material, for example, could be something as simple as a plastic bag, and the way that we dispose of plastic bags, because we think they're cheap and they're readily available, and so we dispose of them, but they're not necessarily disposed of. We dispose of them, but they're disposed elsewhere. And so the underlying problem for me is the way that we treat ready-made disposable objects, but we don't think about where they end up. And we don't often think about where they came from in the first place. What are plastic bags made of? You know, the petroleum. Well, how do we get the petroleum? Whose land is that petroleum extracted from? So I'm always interested in those kind of stories around a material that it's easy for us to go to the shop and just buy it, but that thing doesn't arrive by magic. So it's what the journey is of that material, where it started and where it ends up, and where we intervene in that. Primarily, I love materials. Whatever I'm using, it's usually because I'm very attracted to it. I'm attracted to its malleability, its feel, how tactile it is, how it looks. So there are a lot of things that will bring a material to my attention in the first place. In the gallery, they were on three separate walls, and so in the space, it was spread across the three walls, you would, as you came down, you would see them sort of moving. So the idea is that this implied movement, the sort of plane-like objects, they look like they're in flight. They're like paper planes in flight. So there's an implied movement around the rings and through the space. So that was the idea. But then I start to think about, well, why is this material so easy? Why is it so cheap? Because as an artist, you're always looking for materials that are easily available given your budgets. But what I'm interested in is making objects that reflect or have a dialogue with the language of sculpture. I'm interested in the formal qualities. Circles appear a lot of my work, spheres appear a lot of my work, and so I'm always finding ways to make repeat those objects in different materials. I try to make something that I have to process in some way with my hands, and then I create something that gets your attention. And when you see one of my pieces, for example, if you see Al Kabulan, the map of the continent of Africa, it's made entirely of tissue paper, copper and broken glass. But they're beautiful materials, again, readily available, quite cheap, but all of them have histories, all of them have provenances that are questionable. The paper comes from the trees, the deforestation, that's devastating the world, not just in Africa. The glass, we throw away glass like that, a little stone chip in your windscreen, but that's it, and we dispose of it. But glass doesn't melt, it just doesn't disappear and break down. And similarly with copper, wherever you mine copper, there will be poor people. The way that Africa's viewed, it's always seen as a monolith, that everybody's the same, everything is the same. And so I made, this is the second iteration of the work, and I wanted to make it in a material that is often seen in flat, and you wrap your gifts in it, or you wrap something precious in it and then you throw it away. And I wanted to resurrect it and use it in a different way and make it strong, and then put it in a way that you've never seen it before in this form. It was quite an intense process, using the hand, using folding, using tearing, things that I like to do. And then I used it to fill this map, this template of the continent of Africa, and show Africa on the move. It's an undulating surface, it's very textural, And Africa at the moment, at the continent, it's going through a lot of change. Africa in 10 years, 20 years, you won't recognise it. So I think I wanted to bring that to the fore. I wanted to show it in its beauty, but also I've contrasted it with, at the centre of it, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, using fractured, broken glass. And I've used that glass because it's such a different material. It's such a markedly different material from tissue paper. Because I wanted to, in the language of sculpture, I wanted to see how they would operate together. One is very refracting, reflects light, and then tissue paper absorbing light. So again, playing them off each other. But the Democratic Republic of Congo has a dreadful history, despite the fact that it's such a beautiful country, landscape. It's been gifted with all these resources, and yet it's one of the, if not the poorest country in the world. I think there's only one other African country that's poorer, but they're also devastated by conflict. They're devastated by all sorts of, terrible things, all based around exploitation of its mineral resources. So I wanted to show that landmass, the heart of Africa, and in a beautiful way, to show it, with light, with the heart of light rather than the heart of darkness, which is often portrayed. So that's why I did it. But it's a fractured beauty, so that's why I sort of put the two pieces together. For me, I tend to be attracted to beautiful things, but I can always appreciate something that's not beautiful as long as it's interesting. So I try to make work that's interesting, and I try to make work that has a quality about it that makes you question what you're looking at, makes you question the material, the form, how did she do that? Why did she do that? So it sets up a kind of dialogue with the viewer, and I want it to go beyond. I want it to go beyond so that the questions, the viewer's left with lots of questions. I don't necessarily have all the answers, and that's not what I'm setting out to do. But the aesthetics are really key. The plastic bag spheres that I have in the studio at the moment are really components from larger sculptures, larger installations. They're pieces that I've sort of stored over the years, but recently I brought them out into the studio to have a review, to look at them and to see what I think, where to go next with them. And I enjoyed just looking at them. I enjoyed them in the space. And one of the issues that I was dealing with when I first made them was this notion of sustainability, but also this idea about disposability. And I wanted to bring it to the attention these I find them very beautiful. I find the colours of them really interesting. And I also was thinking about the gesture. Once the bag, because they're made of plastic bags, have served their purpose. When you want to dispose of them, you throw them away, scrunch them up and throw them away. And I decided to sort of repeat that gesture of throwing them away lots of times, but throwing them onto this armature so that they become a conglomerate, then an aggregate of these bags, and then they become something else. But I was thinking about them as metaphors for the way that we dispose of people, and the way that people, they serve their purpose, they have their uses, they're there to do small tasks or big tasks, but then once we've finished with them, we just dispose of them. And we as a society, as a human species. So the bag doesn't, when you dispose of it, what happens? And in the same way with people, what happened to them when you cast them aside? But I was also interested in the way that they work again as a material, the way they reflect light. The different types of bags have different kinds of qualities, and they have trapped air in them, and they stay in that position. They don't break down. The material hasn't broken down. The sheen hasn't worn off, and as I just handle it, it doesn't attract dirt. So there is, I think, a really good example of a material that will outlive me. I don't think art necessarily has to be permanent, but I like the idea of its legacy and its longevity. But I think that up until quite recently, only certain sorts of art were considered art. And I like the shift away from that kind of quite elitist view of art, that it had to be made of marble, it had to be made of, it had to be painted in the classical way. It had to have, there were a lot of art traditions, and I'm glad that they've been broken down. I thought it was just me, but I recently discovered that there are artists in Africa working with plastic, painting with plastic, sculpting with plastic because that material is being disposed of in their landscape, and so that's their ready material. Before, they used to make things, not in every instance, but there was the opportunity to make things from natural materials. Well, that's less and less an option for them, but instead the plastics, the computer throwaway parts, the motherboards, etc., they end up on their in their landfills, and so that's the new material that's being repurposed, not only as a material to create with, but also to comment with, to make some to draw attention to that. And why not? I mean, that's what we've created it. Because there's a bit of me in my practice. I'm at a sort of crossroads in it at the moment, because and one of the reasons I took part in Coastal Currents, which I love to do, it's a lot of fun and you get to meet a lot of people, but I also like the idea of bringing my work out into the open for myself, but also for people to see, because sometimes I forget what it is that I do, and now at this point I have to think about, what do I want to do next, where do I want to go with my work, and do I want to carry on working with these kind of materials, or do I want to change direction and be more process driven? So I like acquiring skills. I love acquiring new skills. So it's whether I now take some of those skills and redirect them into making more handmade objects and installations, rather than running to the ready-mades and just repurposing them, or upcycling. I don't see them as upcycling. I see them as materials to make something else with. So yeah, that's where I am with it. And so I really love that idea of starting with a blank sheet and then creating something just with your hands and just with your tools, and then getting something interesting as a result. Mm.